Okay. So what we're going to start talking about, and I always look where to put this in sequence, is resistance training. We've just spent a month going over in excruciating detail things about muscle and the nervous system and how we generate force. And so what we're going to do now is talk about what happens to the neuromuscular system when we stress that system repeatedly over time, okay, and try to make it adapt so that we can get stronger, okay, for the most part. So that's what we're going to get at with the physiology of resistance training. So I've written a couple of things over here on the board that are going to be our guiding principles, okay? These are the questions that you guys are going to need to be able to answer by the end of our resistance training journey, okay? A big thing is, how much stronger can you get? Okay, how much stronger? I can ask you guys to write it down, and my guess is that hopefully a lot of you, having had our previous classes, would be pretty close to correct. But how strong can you get? How big? How much bigger can you make your muscles? The short answer is not nearly as big as the bros think, okay, without some kind of pharmacological help, right? And then the last two things are kind of the integrated physiology of what happens with the first two, okay? And that maybe it's going to be stuff that you guys haven't had a lot of experience with yet, but it's what changes. If we know that if you resistance train, you get stronger, what are the things that change to allow you to get stronger, okay? And so we will try to tie those changes back to cognition to contraction, to what we know about the cross-bridge cycle, to what we know about the force velocity and force frequency relationships. If you know how muscles work, how the nervous system works to get us force, if we train, we can get more, then we should be able to kind of think critically and evaluate what's going to happen with all of that. Okay. And then the last one is the thing that many of you guys are probably really interested in. And I just kind of go to, but how do we train to maximize increases in muscle size and increases in force? Okay. And the really simple answer is it's not that complicated. You just need to go and do it. Right. Anybody who's like, no, it's sets of this and that and this muscle and that, then these things, they're all trying to fucking sell you something. It's really simple. Okay. It's really, really simple. And we'll see kind of at the end. I think 95% of it is really simple. Right. Go 3 or 4 days a week, do a couple of sets of multiple exercises, make sure you lift until you can't do any more. When it becomes easier, you can do a little bit more, add some weight or some reps, make it harder. That's it. That's the whole ball of wax. And the big thing is that we all hate it and we don't want to do it. Or at least that describes me. Okay. Right. Because I don't have time. So we'll talk about, though, how we're going to integrate those things together. Okay. Any questions about that before we sort of launch ourselves into the mix of all of these things? No? Okay. All right. Okay. So what's going on at the top? I really don't like, there we go, all of this. Okay. So my guess is if I ask you all this question, which apparently also from the assessment, you all really don't like me calling you out in class, which is why so many of you have now put your name tags away on it, which makes it more difficult for me to remember your names. I'm trying to get there with all that. But if I was to ask you and call you out, right, and I say, why do you resistance train? Okay, most people say, I want to get stronger. I want to get bigger muscles, right? This is always fun in January, right? When I'm like, okay, who's got their spring break trip planned? What are we doing? We got time right now to do all this, okay? But we train in general. We want to be stronger. We want bigger muscles, which we're going to call hypertrophy. And then some combination of the application of these things, right? We want to increase athletic performance. Or when you get to be old like me, or my parents who are coming into town this evening who are in their late 70s, simple physical function, right? I can't walk up a flight of stairs. So I need to do some squats, right? Or things like that. We want to increase performance and function. So things that we're going to talk about that are going to also be related to this is how do we cause a change? That's one of the big issues, okay? Why do we train the way that we train? Because we need to evoke a stimulus, and we'll talk about how we're going to fit this together in a minute, okay? But if I ask all of you, which it's Friday, maybe we should, you all seem to like things when we get up and move around. If I ask all of you to get up and do squats until you can't do anymore, I can evoke a stimulus that we hope would drive eventually a change, okay? So we're going to try to identify what is that stimulus? What do we need to do to make ourselves stronger, right? What do I need to change or sort of happen in my muscles to tell the brain, learn how to make this, learn how to recruit more motor units? So we'll talk about the stimulus, we'll talk about what actually changes, and then we'll talk about the mechanism. So the stimulus makes something happen, right? We grow more neuromuscular junctions, right? We make more actin and myosin and make our sarcomeres bigger or something. So what's the mechanism of change as well, right? So a couple things that I know you guys have heard before, okay? You may have even heard them on this exact slide. I don't know. I don't know what Dr. Pink and everybody's doing in health and fitness anymore, but if slides and things looks familiar, it's because they're mine. I taught health and fitness for 10 years. And then last year when Dr. Mike retired, I was finally able to go back to teaching exercise phys. But I had to give up teaching the master's level advanced exercise phys. But so if you see some of this, if you've seen it before, it's because Dr. Pink stole it from me in that way. But how do this training work? A couple of things to keep in mind, okay? And these are really, really important principles, but they're oftentimes forgotten by people that don't know anything about what's going on. For instance, my mother, okay? When we train and we do things, the adaptations that occur, the muscles that get bigger, the muscles that get stronger are the ones that we actually use during that bout of exercise. And they get stronger in relation to whatever we ask them to do, okay? We call this idea training specificity. The adaptation occurs in direct relation or proportion to whatever the stress we put on the system. So if you do squats, your quads get stronger, not your arms, okay? Although there is weirdly some research that says if you squat, it makes your bench press go up. Yeah, I know, it's kind of wild. Squats are good for everything. You can think about doing squats and you get better. So there's this training specificity, okay? And then the idea behind the stimulus and why things are going to want to change is all about the concept of I train, I do something, and it disrupts the physiology inside my muscles or in my nervous system. And that disrupts homeostasis, okay? That disrupts homeostasis. So if somebody had to give us a definition of what is homeostasis, you had to give me a synonym of homeostasis, what would it be? Before y'all make me call people out.
Equilibrium.
Equilibrium, very good, Mike. Okay, balance, equilibrium. Okay, when you exercise, okay, hold your arm out like this. Everybody, hold your arm out. Just hold it there for as long as you can. Don't bash your neighbor in the head. Okay. As you are doing this, we are immediately attempting to disrupt homeostasis in your arms, okay? The longer that we put it here, okay, the more things have to change to try to keep us in equilibrium, to keep us in balance. And eventually, okay, y'all are going to be like, I have to put my arm down because we've disrupted homeostasis so much that you cannot continue. Okay, y'all can put it down. So by specificity, whatever you just did disrupted homeostasis, and so now the body wants to change something. We did not like that. The body does not like to be out of homeostasis. That risks death. Okay? So we did this. That wasn't great. Let's change things so the next time we do that exact same thing tomorrow or next week, we get less disruption of homeostasis. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? The point of training, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the point of training is to disrupt homeostasis in your muscles, in your cardiovascular system, in your respiratory system, in your metabolic systems, whatever it's going to be. Without a disruption, there is no adaptation. Okay? No disruption, no adaptation. What does that look like in practice? Okay. This is your roommate on the treadmill at the Huff, talking on their phone, walking at 3.5 miles an hour. Okay? It's fine, it's good to be active, it's good to walk, no adaptation, because there's no disruption of homeostasis. Okay? This is, and I'm sorry, ladies, you'll pick on the boys plenty too. This is my wife's pink 5-pound dumbbells. And I'm doing curls, and I did like 12, but it's 5 pounds. Ellis can do 5-pound curls. She does sometimes. She thinks it's fun. Okay. It's 5-pound dumbbells. This is not hard. Okay. What are you getting out of that? Nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Why? No disruption of homeostasis. Okay. We can use the 5-pound dumbbells and we can do things to make it hard. You just got to do a bunch of reps to get there. Okay. But that's the idea. That's the idea. We have to do something to disrupt homeostasis to get change. Okay. And so it looks like this. Okay. You exercise. That leads to some acute change. Right? Heart rate goes up. Breathing goes up. We turn over ATP in a muscle. We send impulses from the brain to the muscles to tell them to turn on and generate force, right? Metabolic stress hormone release, apparently I can't spell. Okay, there's some mechanical load on those muscles. This is an acute change that disrupts homeostasis. This is different from rest. That disrupts it. That provides our stimulus. That stimulus applied over and over and over again consistently over days and weeks and months drives adaptations. Those adaptations lead to the chronic changes, an increase in strength, an increase in muscle size, right? Some sort of shift in fiber type, some sort of change in the cardiovascular system or the metabolic systems, a more permanent change, right? That we can see, that we can test, that we can measure. Like bigger muscles, stronger muscles, which then hopefully lets us reach whatever our training goal was. Okay. So you can imagine then, if you know what your training goal is, we can reverse engineer all of this. If your goal is to be as strong as you can, then we've got to figure out what is the change that I need to let me be stronger or as strong as I can, and then work backwards. So I need this adaptation. This is the stimulus to get me that particular adaptation. So that is how I should train, right? To make it very specific to do that. Okay. And you all generally appreciate this. If you want to get better at doing squats, don't go for a run. Okay. If you want to get better at bench pressing, don't squat. Okay. If you want to be better at running, don't ride a bike. So that's more of an aerobic adaptation, but it's the same thing. We all generally get and understand that, but we can really fit it into this kind of paradigm. Okay. Okay. So in order to maximize disruption of homeostasis, we need to apply the principle of progressive overload when we train. Okay. Progressive overload. Training must take place at a higher intensity than whatever you're accustomed to, okay? Again, you must push and tax all of the systems to get them to adapt, okay? If it's easy, make it harder. And there's a huge number of ways that we can possibly do that. But if it's easy, make it harder. Okay, that's the simplest thing. This is, to me, the single biggest factor that most people miss and do not get correct when they exercise train. They don't make it hard enough. Because it's terrible, right? Like, who wants to go and be uncomfortable when you train? Who wants to go and feel bad, right? Running faster is hard. Lifting more weight is harder. Doing more sets or more reps sucks. But if you want to continue to get adaptations, that's what we need to do. Okay? We can overload by altering any number of these components of our systems. Okay? Many of you guys put on your things the other day. We're going to do somewhere between 2 and 4 or 5 sets of a particular resistance exercise. 8 to 10 repetitions. That's great. But we can overload if that's what you were doing by changing your exercise. Do a different exercise for the same muscle group. The easiest thing in a lot of ways is lift more weight. Okay? Lift more weight. If you've been lifting 100 pounds, lift 105. Lift 110. When you can do that, you lift 120. You can change the sets and the reps. Do another set. Do 2 more reps, right? How that's going to go around. You can do a really terrible thing and you can alter your rest periods. You want your workout to be fast but be terrible. Don't rest 3 minutes between sets. Rest 45 seconds. It'll be over fast, but it's terrible. Okay? You can change the rest periods. You can change the order of your exercise. The big thing though is do something here to lead to progressive overload. Okay, so we overload things in a very specific kind of way so that we're going to get the adaptations in the muscle group or for the exercises that we want. It's very, very simple. Link.
Is hypertrophy not more efficient if you have longer rest periods?
No. You read all of the Natural Strength and Conditioning Association things, they argue that if you really want the hypertrophy thing, you should do shorter rest periods because there's a single study, one. And they kind of got one study that shows that if you do shorter rest periods, you get a larger acute increase in growth hormone after the exercise stop, which we now have proven that that acute change doesn't actually have like any role in the hypertrophic response whatsoever, unless you get none. So no, generally no. What having longer rest periods sometimes lets you do, if you take advantage of them, is it lets you do more sets, do more reps, lift more weight. It lets you increase the volume a little bit. And we do know that on some levels, more volume tends to get us a little bit more hypertrophy in that way. So it's a very nuanced kind of thing. So the biggest thing if you want bigger muscles is you need to just go and lift. That's the single biggest component. Okay. Great questions. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of definitions here because I think it's important before we jump into different things. Okay. I'm going to talk about changes in strength. How strong can you get? What I mean by that is the maximal force that a muscle group can generate. Okay. Now that could be the most weight I can squat one time. It can be a 1 rep max. The most weight I can curl one time or bench. The most weight you can do once through a full range of motion. Okay. It could also be the most force you can generate in the lab if we test it isometrically. All right. So if you come to my lab, we never do 1 rep max testing. We're always doing isometric force for different reasons. It's experimentally, it's a little easier, especially with untrained people, to do all of that. But that is strength. Okay. If we talk about muscular endurance, and we will do very, very little of that, that is gonna indicate an ability to do a submaximal load, so some amount of weight that is less than your max over and over and over again, okay? Now, in some instances, people will say, if you want to train endurance, you need to do, we talk about, you gotta be able to do it more than 15 times or more than 20 times. That's how you train muscular endurance, okay? And so we'll circle back to that at the end, but if you're talking about endurance, that's more of what we're getting at, okay? And then the idea of strength training, okay? If people use the term strength training, they're usually talking about a training paradigm by which we want to have a goal of increasing maximal force with some accompanying increase in muscle size. Okay, typically, that is going to involve, okay, repetition range in the 6 to 10 or 6 to 12 reps, lifted until fatigue or failure. So I can do 6, I can't do 7. I can do 10, I can't do 11. That's gonna be a really, really important thing later on, where you get an increase in strength and an increase in size, okay? And so, other things they talk about endurance training, we wanna do like 35 to 40 reps or something until fatigue. Think of endurance training for a lot of people as I do, as many push-ups and sit-ups as I could, okay? And you get to be my age, you're like, okay, I can't do that many push-ups. I could probably use to work out some more and lose a little bit of weight. It's kind of hard, but for most of you guys, right? Things like that, body weight kind of stuff is very often gonna be sort of more endurance focused than strength because you already have enough strength. Okay? Even though we can use what we used to think of as endurance training, if you go all the way to failure, if you do enough reps with all of that, we can actually induce hypertrophy there. We'll talk about that as we move forward, okay? Okay. Now, brass tacks time, okay? How strong can you get? And the answer is quite strong, okay? Quite strong. But it all depends upon where you start. Okay, I'll show you all some data in the next slide about how we've arrived at these numbers, but most of you guys, okay, most of you guys with proper training, we could likely increase your maximal strength by 25 to about 100%. So you might be able to double your strength over the course of 3 to 6 months. Those of you that are not as strong to begin with and are not as accustomed to lifting weights to begin with, likely have a greater chance and capacity to lean towards that 100% side. Okay, we tend to see greater increases in strength during dynamic contraction or 1 rep max kind of testing than we do other types of testing. Why is that the case? Why is that the case? Land.
Neural connections.
Neural connections, okay, good. Yes, you are correct, but I still have those same neural connections if you test me isometrically or something like that, right? So why here? When it's definitely on to something. How do we train? If I told you guys this will be fun, I'll just pick someone. Who shall, I'm trying to think who on their form specifically said they didn't like being called out, so that I don't call on those particular people. Maybe I should pick on them. Maria, can I ask you, if you were to do a squat, what would that look like? Yeah, do you want to just stand up and do, and can you stand up and do a squat for us? If you were to train doing squats, what would that look like? Just do one, just one. I know, I'm sorry. Okay, one squat. If I was to test your maximal strength doing a squat, what would that look like in comparison to what she just did? They're all like, what the fuck is he asking? Matt.
I would want some external resistance, preferably close to 1 rep max.
Okay, but like, would the movement pattern be the same, basically?
Pretty much.
Pretty much? Mallory, you say no, why not?
You're at max, like your true 1 rep max, you'll probably be like stuck at the bottom for a second and then get yourself up.
Okay, okay, slower movement maybe, and
But
it's
the-
kind of
but the
some,
pattern
you're
is the
struggling, but like the actual like, I'm here, these muscles are on, am I doing that? Kind of the same? Okay, so why do we get greater gains in dynamic? It's because it's all about specificity of training, right? We are testing your strength, doing a movement pattern that is as similar as possible to the movement pattern you evoked when you were training. Which then, to Landon's point, we're going to have neural adaptation. We're going to learn the correct motor unit firing patterns as this goes along. Excuse me. Okay. Now the fun part. Okay. Men and women, if we normalize them to where they start, generally can increase their strength to roughly a similar extent. Okay. We spent about the first 70 years of ourselves as a field thinking that women could not increase their strength as much as men, right? I don't want to say things and get myself in trouble, but right, the sexism in some ways maybe was not intentional, but it was like, okay, right? Maria can lift 100 pounds and Stacy can lift 200 pounds. Stacy's strength goes up 10%. He can now lift 220 pounds. Maria can lift 110. He gained 20 pounds. She gained 10. Therefore, men can get a greater strength increase than women, right? We didn't think to normalize to where they were starting. And so we spent like 70 years thinking that women couldn't get their muscles as big or couldn't get as strong, all because of math, right? All because of math. And so we now know that similar gains between men and women, similar gains between older and younger people up to about 75 or 80 years of age, okay? So there's no differences in the midst of this. Because for the most part, the strength gains are primarily driven by neural changes, and that cognition to contraction pathway where all of that neural stuff goes is essentially the same between men and women, between old people and young people. There's no influence of estrogen or testosterone in that particular pathway. Okay, so that's what we've got going on. The primary thing, if you had to pick one thing that drives what your increase in strength is going to be, is how strong are you to start with? And that how strong you are to start with is primarily driven by how accustomed to a way of training are you. Okay. An untrained person is going to likely increase their strength to a greater extent than a person that has already been trained. And this is a problem for us with exercise adherence that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Because you get a lot stronger really fast when you start if you've never done something and you're like, this is awesome, look at me, I'm doing so good. And then that shit levels off and it becomes harder and then people get frustrated, right? And so it can be a little bit of a problem. And we'll talk about why that happens. There are two primary components to strength gains. The first and in some ways largest driver is an increase in the ability of the motor cortex to make the motor neurons in your spinal cord fire and adequately connect and turn on all of the muscle fibers that you have. We call those neural adaptations, okay? Neural adaptations. You can learn how to make better use of the muscles you have, okay? The second way you can get stronger, although there are some people that argue, I disagree with them, but their argument is kind of fun, that we get what we call contractile protein adaptations. This is just your muscles get bigger, right? It seems ridiculous, right? If I ask you all, who's the strongest person in the class, the first thing you're going to do is look around and be like, who's the biggest? Who has the biggest muscles? Because intuitively, we just think a bigger muscle has more actin-myosin, more cross bridges, more core, right? Okay. And yet there are people that will argue that just because you made your muscle bigger after training, that doesn't mean it's stronger, or that the strength gain is due to all of that. They have some fun arguments. I disagree with them, right? So there's really two components. Your nervous system gets better at turning on whatever muscle you have. That's a big one. And then your muscles actually get bigger. Okay. The problem, as we will see, is that most of us can get very large neural adaptations, and most of us are not going to be able to get nearly as much of an increase in muscle mass as we think we're going to be able to, right? As we think we're going to. Okay. The time course, the time it takes during a bout of training or over months of training when each of these things happen is different. Okay. Neural adaptations generally take place first, and then they level off. Then it takes us a couple of months to get bigger muscles. These things happen. Then we get a little bit of an increase in neural while this is happening. And then at some point, the increase in size kind of reaches its genetic potential. And then people that are very advanced lifters that have been doing it for a long time, that have kind of reached their potential for muscle size, the only way very, very, very well-trained advanced lifters can ever get any stronger is through some final neural adaptations. And we do think without pharmacological interventions, there is some cap on all of this. Okay. You can only get so big and you can only get so strong. Okay. So there is some cap on those things. All right. So you may ask yourself, Dr. Black, where do we get these numbers? Okay. Why do you say 25 to 100%? Where did this come from? Why is that what my textbook says? Why is that the generally accepted thing? I saw a dude on TikTok that said he got 300% stronger or something, right? And maybe that's true. But what I am showing you right here, these are data from, unless there's been a new one, the single largest study on adaptations to resistance training. It has the largest number of participants that we've ever really had. Okay, this was conducted in the sort of greater Boston area. This was done by the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, by folks at Yale and folks at Boston University together. They have about 600 participants, relatively evenly split between men and women. Okay, and what they did was they did 12 weeks of training, and they had them do bicep curls. Single arm bicep curls, okay? And they did 3 days per week for 12 weeks. The first month, they did 3 sets of 12 each time. The middle, they did 3 sets of 8. They did 3 sets of 6. Now, we can argue and hand wave over, was this the right way or the wrong way, or what are we doing in the midst of this? But this is all generally pretty good. What you see here on the top is called a histogram. This is the increase in strength doing their maximal 1 rep max bicep curl. This one down here is, they came to the lab, and this is isometric strength. So lock your arm like this and pull against a force transducer while you're at 90 degrees of elbow flexion. Okay. And so what you can see is, in general, you've got, I think the women are in white and the men are in black on these. But a histogram just shows us this is the percentage of this nearly 600 people that got this percentage change in their strength, right? So if we look here, right, this is at about a 20% increase in strength. About 7% of men were there, and about 4% or 3.5% of women got that. So we look at it this way. Okay. On average, in this study, men got about 40% stronger, women got about 64%. Okay, that's different. Why? Women were less trained to begin with. Okay. So even though these people had not done bicep curls in the last couple of years before they entered the study, we generally see that for whatever reason that on average, men tend to have a little bit more resistance training experience than women. That may not be the case now. This was published in 2005. So these data were probably collected in like 2002 and 2003. Okay, that was done 20 years ago. If we look at things, the one thing that has changed in my 25 years of being an exercise physiologist is it's women doing resistance training has gone up significantly. Women buying into resistance training in the way that we used to think of as this is how men resistance train, right, has gone up dramatically in those ways. And that's a really good thing. Strength is good. Muscle mass is good. It's really good from a health and a function standpoint in those ways. So it may be that, okay? If we looked at an isometric strength, you'll note that it's less, right? Again, this is specificity of training. Isometric strength is mostly related to muscle mass, and this is mostly related to, we're testing them in the way that they were trained, okay? So this is where these numbers are gonna come from. But you will note, look, we got some ladies that were like 230% strong, right? Our strongest guy who got the most was at about 150 here, okay? But you will note how these things are kind of out here, way more women out on this end than there are men. And there's lots of individual variation, okay? All of you are different. You're all going to respond to training differently in these ways, and we need to keep all of that in mind. But that's where these numbers come from, okay? That's where these numbers come from. All right. So if we know that people are going to get stronger, we know you guys are going to get stronger, how? Why? What is going to change? What is the thing that changes? Okay. Again, now we're going to tie this back into parts of cognition to contraction and one of our muscle receptors. Okay. The neural adaptations that are going to change that allow us to become stronger occur after one single bout of resistance training. I want to make this very, very clear. Okay. You guys, when you took health and fitness, which might have been last semester or a couple of semesters ago, are y'all still doing the bench press 1 rep max lab? Okay. You don't have to put your hands up, but just think to yourself, if it wasn't you, was there someone in your class that it was my favorite day of class when I would teach that class, because we would get people, oftentimes some of the ladies, who'd never done a bench press before in their life, ever, okay? And so when there's no need to bench press, it's completely unfunctional unless you're an offensive lineman or something in football. You never do this in your daily life, ever, okay? Never. It's completely unfunctional. So tell that to the bros next Monday, okay? It does not really matter. But we do that because it is relatively uncommon. Many of you, if you don't ever bench very much, you test your 1 rep max one time on that one day, and you come back a couple of days later after you get over your soreness, and you're already stronger. You can already do more within a couple of days because of neural adaptations. They happen immediately. One bout is enough, okay? But what's going to change that lets us do this? Well, we increase our ability to recruit the high threshold type 2, or especially type 2X motor neurons and motor units. Okay, those last group of motor neurons that we don't use very often in our everyday lives. Many of us struggle to recruit them unless we practice at it. And that's one of the things that happens. You only need them when you generate a lot of force. So you got to try to generate a lot of force, or you've got to at least fatigue yourself very, very heavily to get there. We also improve something called synchronization. I know they don't call it synchronized swimming anymore, but anybody ever watching the Olympics, what they used to call the synchronized swimming, right? So crazy stuff. Can't hold my breath more than like 20 seconds. And those ladies are down there for like 3 minutes doing all kinds of crazy stuff. It's very, very impressive. But when something is synchronized, right, it's all happening at the exact same time, right? It all looks the same, the exact same movement at the exact same time. As you become more familiar, okay, doing a certain exercise, we are better able to synchronize when you turn on various motor units that go to the agonist muscle and your accessory muscle. Okay, so I'm gonna draw a thing up on the board here. And again, I will ask the inevitable question. Physics, okay, physics. Anybody remember anything from if you had physics about sort of fluid dynamics and how waves behave in water or anything? Oh, like that. Absolutely, all right. But you imagine, right, I've got a wave that's doing this, okay? If I have a wave coming in the other direction, right, that is exactly sort of 180 degrees off kilter from where I am, will I get a wave at all? Or do they cancel each other out? Right? If you did this, what you end up with if you slip on the water is it's flat. There's no way. Right? Because they're exactly in sort of counter sync in this way. If, right, I got a wave coming from both directions, but they are also going up from each direction at the same time, exactly synchronized, they add together and the wave gets bigger, right? So you've got them coming from both directions, but if they're in phase, you actually get even bigger, and I wrote up on the wall, picture me, right? You get an even bigger one. The same thing happens in your muscles. When you line up all of the action potentials and you get every motor unit firing at exactly the same instant in time, then you get this force that sort of ramps the force up a little bit more. But it actually becomes less steady because you get this like rampant force dip in between the action potential. It's like high force down, high force down. And so you don't notice it when you're lifting in that way. But if you come to the lab and we measure the electrical activity in your muscles, or we watch what is happening to the force, you see these little ripples in it. It's called force steadiness. But you increase synchronization, you get more force. Weirdly, if you want really good fine motor skills, you actually train yourself to be very, very asynchronous, okay? Which we can also do. So very precise low force contractions, you need asynchronous firing of the motor units so that you don't get a shift in sort of up, down, up, down. It needs to be very, 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 very steady, okay? We see some level, it's really hard to measure. We do see a little bit of an increase in firing rates during all of that, so more action potentials in a given period of time. And another big thing like we talked about on Wednesday is you turn off the Golgi tendon, or you learn how to reset the force value that activates the Golgi. Okay? But the real big thing is number one. This is the really, really big thing. Most of you have some proportion of a muscle or muscle group that you are unable to call into action, right, most of the time. And when you resistance train, you're teaching the nervous system how, by making it work really hard, by trying to increase the amount of force we're getting, by working to failure and fatigue, we're trying to teach the nervous system how to call on those very, very last bits and turn on all of that muscle. Okay? This is the big thing. It occurs really, really fast, okay? Oftentimes after like one bout, it's a particularly kind of novel activity, and it occurs very, very, very far in advance of any changes in muscle size. This is the primary way in the first 6 to 8 weeks of resistance training that you get stronger. And in a lot of people, you get a lot stronger really, really fast. Okay, really, really fast. Okay. It is very specific to the muscle group and exercise type that you're using. Okay. This is where all of the specificity comes in. This is why if you're training doing a full range of motion bicep curl, you're going to get the most stronger. That's a terrible English phrase, right? When you test doing a full range of motion bicep curl, because of that specificity, right? It's likely the only way that advanced lifters can get stronger. And there's a really cool thing that happens in the midst of all of this. It's a thing called the crossover effect. What that means for all of you that want to be physical therapists and occupational therapists, it has amazing applications to rehabilitation. Crossover effect tells us that if I train my right arm, my left arm also gets stronger doing, if I train my right arm doing curls, my left arm will also get stronger doing curls, even though I've not done any training with it whatsoever. Right? And that's because the area in the motor cortex that originates the signals that go to my right arm are in roughly the same place as the areas that originate what goes to my left arm. And the motor neurons that go to my right arm sit in the spinal cord in very close proximity to the motor neurons that go to my left arm. So there is this spillover of the nervous system from one side to the other. Usually get about half the effect or so. So if I can train and my right arm gets 50 pounds stronger, than my left arm might actually get like 25 pounds stronger. Okay, so it's a very, very wild effect. So people have begun doing a lot of this with athletes that have had like ACL reconstructions, people that have had strokes, or that have Parkinson's or MS and have this sort of a very specific bilateral. They've got a good side and a bad side. Train the good side, and the bad side will also get some spillover effects and get better, right? You've done your ACL and you're not cleared structurally to lift a heavy weight on that side, lift heavy weights on the other, and at least get some of the neural adaptation that we're seeing. All right. We will pick up with this on Monday, okay? And hopefully have tests to get back. Please, if you want, turn in the assessment. Have a good weekend. Make good choices.